So hi, Shauna.
Hi, Mike. How's it going?
Going well. I think it's time to talk a little assessment.
It is.
And I think one thing that's going to be important going forward for us to stress or clarify with our business department members is that really the department discussion practice guide, the 6 points on that guide, really match up well with the form that's out on the assessment website that you guys in the assessment committee have put together. So there's a nice link there.
The goal of this is just to take what we're already doing and share out to each other and come up with a plan moving forward.
Got it. So I'll go ahead and start and maybe share one of my course learning outcomes with you.
Yeah.
This was from my management class, Business 270 in spring of 19. And the one course learning outcome that I wanted to talk about was executing role play activities, modeling important management functions.
Okay.
And as far as the teaching method that I used, we did a series of in-class role plays focusing on major management functions like discipline, delegation, conflict resolution. And the role plays were submitted in worksheet form with the major sections easily identifiable.
Okay.
Students then did the worksheet in did the role play in teams of 2. And at the end, we had a little critique section where they talked about what went well and what we could do to strengthen the role play. As far as my assessment of that learning outcome, at the beginning of class, I checked the worksheets, make sure they were complete. Those that were complete got an initial. Those that needed, that were a little lacking, got a special mark, and that'll probably result in a little bit lower grade going forward. And then during the role play, I used a management technique called management by walking around, MBWA. So I would just cruise around the classroom, answer questions, make sure students were on task, and just help if they needed help. Then at the end of the process, I collected the work and graded it.
Perfect.
As far as the results and my general feeling about that particular role play, I think the role play activities worked really well in the classroom. It's a much better way to learn management functions and to understand management techniques, much better than just reading about them. And I also found that the students were quite engaged and into it. They approached this with a lot of confidence because they had worked on the worksheet. They knew exactly how they were going to proceed. And I think it allowed them to really learn the delegation techniques quite effectively.
Perfect.
So yeah, do you have a learning outcome that you had?
I do. I actually just came from teaching, so I didn't get a chance to print out my assessment. But I do remember that in spring I assessed my Business 102 class, which is entrepreneurial thinking. And the CLO for that one that I focused on was entrepreneurial fundamentals and doing that through a business action plan. And so the way in which I taught that to the students was I first had them watch a couple of videos based on entrepreneurial fundamentals, and then I had them do some readings that talked about how to take those fundamentals and move them towards more actionable steps. And then we also took a lot of time to do research on a problem or solution that they were interested in. I then would assess them by having them pick a problem and solution that they would research and then create an action plan for. They would then market test it with their friends, classmates, family members, and even actual potential customers if they knew any. And they would then create an action plan that would hopefully move that problem solution forward. The results of that report actually were really good. Students were given a rubric, they were given a template that would help them sort of organize their thoughts, but they had to complete a certain number of steps in real life that were actionable, that moved towards the goal. There were a couple of hiccups that I found because over time I've realized I've added more and more sort of complexities to that project in hopes that students would continue to progress. For example, I added an entrepreneurial or an entrepreneur interview.
Right.
So they had to find an entrepreneur to interview, and that maybe was sort of a more difficult part of the project for them, or creating that action step was more difficult. But overall, it was a good experience for the students, and most of them did achieve the CLO.
Great.
Yeah.
That sounds good. So I think maybe we could just reflect a little bit on on the results of our conclusions, maybe some changes in teaching that the assessment brought about. I know when I was assessing my role play activities in the management class, I realized that I really hadn't supported the role play activities with enough formative assessment, which basically is a fancy way of saying I didn't really lead in with a lot of background help. We just kind of jumped in and did the role play. So after I did the assessment, I realized that I could strengthen things up quite a bit by adding a couple of components. So I added a case study that specifically spoke to effective management techniques, and we hadn't done that before, so I added that in. And then I created a lecture. At that point, I created a lecture that focused on management and why managers often failed to delegate. And of course, some of the reasons are they don't know how to delegate, or they are afraid of giving up power, or they simply don't think their employees have the skills. They're kind of a Theory X manager, and so that gets in their way. But I think in general, by supporting with that formative assessment, I think it's really strengthened the role play activities.
Awesome. Okay. And I had a similar feeling, is that I didn't necessarily do enough formative assessment for my students, especially with the entrepreneur interview portion. And so what I ended up doing this current quarter is removing that component from the actual action plan and focusing more on helping students learn how to connect with and identify entrepreneurs in their community, and make that sort of an easier task for them that doesn't seem quite so scary.
Got it.
So we did a whole module on that too. Awesome. So now we can kind of transition into thinking about what our plans are for next year, or for this upcoming year. Assessment Committee really wants us to focus on crafting for our annual review an actual plan for us as a department.
Right.
And we want to base that definitely on what you and I have discussed, as well as what Samad and Michael Gervin will talk about, and I'll incorporate their feedback as well. So the first question is, what were our key findings, and how do we go about our discussion? So it sounds like we did our pairs, which works really well for our department. What were some of the key findings from this discussion for you?
Well, I think one of the key things for me was that it's really, really important to stress that you must review your course learning outcomes first before you start this assessment process, and you've got to have 4 to 5 good, measurable course outcomes. And if you've got that, it makes the entire follow-up process of assessment much more effective.
Absolutely. I can definitely agree with that. I think it's really good for us to make sure that we are updating our CLOs, and then we're actually teaching based on those. What happens in our assessment cycle is that sometimes we assess CLOs that aren't up to date, or we teach things that aren't in line with the CLOs. So making sure that our CLOs are updated and that we're teaching based on those will be that is a good key finding that I'm finding here.
Right. And I think another takeaway for me was I was pleasantly surprised that really this process of assessing the course learning outcomes, once you got into it, really did not take a lot of time, especially when you're starting with good, solid, measurable learning outcomes.
And then lastly, I think a final takeaway for us is that we were able to identify some real changes that we needed to make in each of our classes that came from our assessment that we may not have otherwise been able to see.
Right. Yeah, no, I think that's true. So I think maybe to kind of wrap things up, Shauna, could you give us a feel for like planning going forward? What's your vision for the business department with regard to assessment?
Well, based on sort of just our discussion, and again, we'll incorporate what our other colleagues have to share. I think one of the biggest things for us is just to focus on completing our assessments. That's a really important piece, because then we can do this work and make a plan as a department. Based on this discussion, I noticed that we both are looking at CLOs that focus on both critical thinking and communication. And so I think that's actually a really good focus for us to have as a department. Each of our classes incorporates some form of communication and critical thinking. And so if we really target those particular CLOs, I think that will create some direction and focus for our department for this year. And then lastly, I think just making sure that we are cheerleaders for each other in assessment, but then also reminding ourselves that it's not that difficult to do this. It just takes, a little bit of time, but our meeting here has probably been about 10 or 15 minutes.
Right.
It's something that's very doable and it's important to guide our department for student learning.
Right. No, I think that's a good plan.
Awesome.
Sounds
Thanks so
good.
much, Mike.
Yep. Thank you, Sean.